and beverages. And I am going to talk, as was mentioned, about some of my favorite beverages overall, per se, fermented beverages and their influences on health and disease. And I'll try to cover a little bit about the processing and some on the composition of the beverages I'll be speaking of, as well as consumption patterns and also activities, biological activities for health and also disease, as I'll be talking mostly about the alcoholic fermented beverages. You know, it's a yin-yang. There's potentially benefit, but potential harm as well. And like Dr. Raskuta, I also, as a U.S. federal bureaucrat, have to state that these are my opinions and not necessarily those of the National Cancer Institute. And I have no other financial relationships to disclose. And the types of beverages that are fermented historically, traditionally, are many. Dr. Raskuta did talk a lot about the milk, and kefir is one of those products that are fermented, and also beer is fermented via grains, wine through grapes, and there's a multitude of other different kinds of grains that are used to ferment and produce beverages, and also tea, as kombucha is very popular in the U.S. these days. And I have a couple nice slides of some of the unfiltered sake and a corn brew beverage that is also unfiltered in this case. As I mentioned, will be talking mostly about the alcoholic fermented beverages. Many sources have been utilized throughout the world to produce these beverages, including various grains, different fruits, honey as well, and many of the products result in some of the things that we know a lot about, perhaps personally and also through our knowledge of food technology, such as the ciders and the wines. But also there are distilled beverages from many of these food sources. And I won't get into that so much. I'm going to be speaking about wine predominantly and a little bit about beer consumption as well. I believe this has been talked about a couple times already this morning. The pathway that we're talking about is an alternative to the mammalian, if you will, metabolic route for glycolysis, and that being for yeast producing ethanol from the product pyruvate in anaerobic fermentation. And the lactic acid bacteria would produce from pyruvate lactic acid, of course. But we're talking about yeast fermentation to result in alcohol. I want a little bit about the consumption of alcohol. This is a source I found on the internet, and I'm not so sure. I said needs replication because I'm not so sure if it can be validated. I'm not so certain, I should say, of the source. But I thought it was intriguing, and it's been cited several times. So in the U.S., we're at the top for volume of wine and beer, wine anyway, that comes into the United States. But for per capita data, who drinks the most beer? It's some of the northern European countries, as displayed here, and who drinks the most wine? It's some of the Mediterranean, if you will, countries. And so this is, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't know, if anybody else can verify this is true, that the Vatican per capita is the most consuming. They do use it, let's say, for many rituals as well. So maybe that's why they're classified as such. I just thought that was a nice graphic to show, that this is a popular beverage, and we have to take it seriously, its production and processing. Here's some data about consumption from the European Perspective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition, and this is a large cohort, the EPIC cohort that is utilized often in nutrition studies for observational findings. And here's the information for men. So this is data collected from one 24-hour food diary, and you can see that in here we have the different places in the epic. So epic has several, maybe more than 19 different sites. 10 different countries are represented. And here we see the different countries from Spain all the way to Sweden. But you can see that some of them, for men anyway, some of the more Mediterranean located, if you will, countries are consuming more wine, whereas in the northern European countries, perhaps they're drinking more beer. And this is a little different than for the data that they had for women, where you can see predominantly throughout the different cohorts, within the cohort, that the women are consuming more wine. Overall, this paper did not got a little bit into quantity, but for the most part, you could guess that men are consuming more quantity-wise than women. And so the EPIC has used this information to look at associations for different outcomes, different cancers. And I did not present that data. Just want to give you a little bit about consumption patterns. Here is the simplistic graphic on the winemaking process and the very important yeast molecule. I have a hard time saying it, but many probably in this room have more experience saying it. Very important utilitarian fungi yeast that has been utilized often for beer and bread and wine processing as well. In some wine production, maybe much wine production, there's a second fermentation that is also used. And this is a bacterial fermentation to reduce the malic acid content that can be a little bit sour in the beverage, to reduce it to lactic acid. So malic acid to lactic acid. And it brings also still tart, makes it tart, but a little more palatable. And I think this is also used in Chardonnay in white wine making, but predominantly it's utilized in red wine making. And this was an interesting thing, that now that everybody's interested in the microbiome and where it is everywhere, some recent investigators have cited that perhaps some of that specialness about wine and where it comes from, another word I can't say very well, the terroir, it has to do with the microbial constituents from the grapes, from the soil, from the bark, from the leaves, and it might give rise to downstream qualities of the beverage. So the microbial communities associated with agricultural products may associate with downstream quality characteristics, elucidating these relationships between production climate and microbial patterns may enhance biological control within these systems, improving supply, consumer acceptance, economic value, agricultural of the agricultural commodities. And I portend maybe the beneficial or harmful aspects of the beverage. So what's in wine? Well, yeast is integral to crafting complex wines from simple sugar-rich grape juice. And so wine is different from grape juice. Why is that? Because some of the components are wholly generated by the yeast during fermentation as part of the metabolism by the yeast, while others are essentially created from the grapevine, so the constituents in the grape. And there are a large number of compounds synthesized and modified by the wine yeast and have a major impact on the quality of the beverage and also possibly on health and disease. And here's a nice graph that shows some of the major constituents in wine. You can see that it's predominantly very similar between red and white wine for the glycerol, for many of the constituents, except for the phenols. You can see that the red wine, it has higher phenol content. Alcohol content is fairly similar. I think, though, that we know that sometimes red wine can have a higher alcohol content, and water is similar for both. The percent water for both red and white wines. A little more. I'm going to go a little bit more into the phenolic compounds in wine, because this is where all the potential activity is thought to be with regard to some of the things we're interested in health and disease. And so the phenolic compounds, as I mentioned, are a large group of several hundred compounds. I couldn't put a table up here. It would be too busy, so I put some text on, which is also a little busy. But these compounds include phenolic acids, stilbenoids, flavonoids, dihydroflavanols, and if everybody can say these, you're doing well, right? After drinking wine, perhaps. Dihydroflavanols, anthocyanins, flavanol monomers, catechins, flavanol polymers as well. And broadly, they're categorized into the flavonoids, these phenolics, flavonoids, and the non-flavonoids. And the flavonoids include the anthocyanins, and these are very important for the color and also some other attributes. I just have one other slide regarding anthocyanins, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about resveratrol, and that is of major interest, even though it's in low abundance in wine, but it still has a lot of recent interest in understanding its activities in the mammalian system. I just thought this was interesting to show you that we really don't know. Well, here's somebody has outlined what they think is going on with the aging in wine with the monomer, the anthocyanins. But over time, there's a great degree of change, producing different colors over time, and this gives rise to the quality of the wine. And this is an area of research, I think. What are these constituents in the bottle after many years, and how different they are from batch to batch. You can imagine there's a lot of variability in regards to that. But I also wanted to mention, talk much more about resveratrol. Here's the biological composition, or the chemical composition. An analysis of red wine from many different countries, it has a range of resveratrol from say 0, probably a little bit more than 0, to 6.8 milligrams per liter. And as you may have seen or heard of, even from the press, the literature touting the benefits of resveratrol, indications have suggested that you must drink 2 or 3 bottles or whatever a day to get the appropriate amount of resveratrol. And investigators have looked at the various responses and how much is needed. And it seems like a lot of the work is done in the 150 milligram to 500 milligram range, and have received some responses in that range. But there's some evidence to suggest that maybe a smaller range is appropriate if you're in a situation where somebody already has an insult. But a lot of this we just don't know. And I have in a couple slides a recent report about a very low level of resveratrol and it giving a beneficial response. Here's some information, very interesting, very small studies, small number of subjects utilized in these human feeding studies to look at bioavailability of some of these constituents from red wine and also from beer. But here we'll look at some of the metabolites from resveratrol, and you can see that there's a great amount study to study of variability in the bioavailability from the resveratrol, given the same amount presumably was consumed in these various studies. So just to point out that from these low doses of wine, you can find resveratrol and its metabolites in the system. And investigators are interested. Is it the resveratrol in isolation? Can we just give a lot of it in like a pill form, or is there something about the red wine, the vehicle, that is important for bioavailability in the health effects? And in this study, they compared some supplementation, 15 tablets, quite a bit, with a hefty, a nice big glass of red wine, and they looked at plasma and urine excretion, and they found, and they also looked at many of the metabolites, and some of the metabolites from that are arrived at through metabolism from microbes in the gut, and they found that actually there was a greater response over time with the capsules. And they thought that this may be due to this later absorption with the grape extract supplementation, and it gave time for the microbial metabolites, the microbes to metabolize the resveratrol. Now, this is one study. Other studies have shown that maybe it's the beverage for which that the resveratrol is makes it more bioavailable. So there's variability with regards to how you should be consuming for resveratrol if that's your ultimate interest to enhance your resveratrol intake over and above the pleasures and other constituents that are in the wine and can give some benefit perhaps. Investigators as I delved into this topic, there's so much going on with wine innovation, with wine processing. I don't know if anybody's in this area at all. It's just fascinating. Here's a group that is trying to engineer some of the yeast utilized in fermentation to enhance resveratrol in the final product. And they were able to find that resveratrol content of the red wine fermented with the engineered strains was twice higher than that of the control, indicating that this could be possibly utilized to enhance the resveratrol amount in the wine. And here's the study that I mentioned where very recently published, where they found a small amount of resveratrol was actually beneficial over a larger dose. And in this study, they utilized both animals and a little bit of human work. And in the animals, it's a transgenic mouse model that produces colorectal adenomas. And then they used a low dose of resveratrol and a high dose to compare. But they found that the low dose had suppressed the cancers, and also the biomarker was increased. That this biomarker would be thought to be beneficial, and also the expression of a tumor suppressor gene was enhanced. And they also did a little bit of human work in this study, and what they did was they exposed, they took tissue from patients, the colorectal cancer tissue, and they added resveratrol and looked at a biomarker. And they found this biomarker, the AMP, the adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, and they found that it was enhanced. And this is ex vivo, it's not in vivo. The people didn't take resveratrol, but they added resveratrol ex vivo. But they found that this was enhanced, this beneficial biomarker. And they also did a study in a small number of patients where they gave a tracer of resveratrol so they can follow the molecule. And they found, and they did utilize 2 different doses, and they found that the smaller dose, there was more of a beneficial effect for this antioxidant enzyme compared to the higher dose. So here's just an example where the lower dose suggested more benefit than the higher dose. So more to come on this. This had a lot of interest in the press, I think it was just last week, to suggest that maybe we don't need the higher doses of resveratrol. And there are many biological activities. Tom Wang, maybe as we get into the mechanism section, is likely to talk about some of these pathways that are involved in cancer suppression, and resveratrol participates in many of these as an anti-inflammatory, an enhancer of autophagy. This is controlled cell death, and also apoptosis, and that's controlled cell death, apoptosis. And diminishing cell proliferation, and a host of other activities for resveratrol. Studies have also looked at wine and effects on different disorders. So these are epidemiologic findings for the most part, observational. Maybe a few small clinical studies are in this little figure, but you can see that moderate wine consumption has been suggested to reduce osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and neurological diseases. Now, it's uncertain if it's the alcohol or the wine in many of these studies, so the word is not out. You may recall that there's this supposedly U or J-shaped curve with regards to alcohol consumption and mortality, so that if you're drinking less, you may have greater risk. but if you're drinking a moderate amount of alcohol, it may, and I have a J-shaped curve coming up, but if you're drinking moderate levels of alcohol, this may be beneficial for reducing mortality. One study looked at moderate alcohol consumption and adherence to a Mediterranean dietary pattern, and we know that the Mediterranean dietary pattern has been suggested in observational and in clinical settings for a beneficial effect on cardiovascular disease. And then in this study, they looked at, well, why are some people adhering more or less to a Mediterranean diet? And alcohol was one of the reasons for moderate alcohol consumption, suggesting adherence to the Mediterranean diet. And it was thought that this was predominantly wine. Also, exercise and obesity was negatively correlated with adherence to a Mediterranean dietary pattern. Here's that J-shaped curve that I had mentioned, and this one is for wine. This group of investigators were interested in whether or not consuming wine and the risk for fatal and non-fatal vascular events, is that a U-shaped curve or a J-shaped curve? And why is that important? Is that for a J-shaped curve, once you go over and above the amount that is what the non-consumers are drinking, then you have greater risk. So you have lower risk or a little higher risk at little levels, and then your risk is at moderate consumption is more beneficial. And then, as the confidence intervals show here, with the J-shaped curve, the more you drink, the more risk of these cardiovascular events. And just also one other caution is for metabolic syndrome in glasses of wine per day. Wine may be helpful for enhancing our high density lipoprotein levels and reducing our triglycerides, but there are many studies to suggest wine and other alcohol, the more you may drink, that this may be not a good thing for blood pressure. So just as a note of caution there. Now, I know we're pressed for time. I have a few more slides on beer, but I can stop here. Beer is another fascinating story, similar to the wine, and rich in many different constituents, and as a result, really, of the brewing process. And also, there's some of these constituents are metabolized in our intestine. So the metabolism may be variable depending upon the microbiota in your intestine. And also there are many different activities from some of these constituents in beer. I think Tom Wang will also be talking about some of these pathways. This is, we won't go into it. And then another cautionary note that there's been some work with beer consumption and the risk of colorectal cancer. And here's a meta-analysis from many different observational studies suggesting an association, increased association with beer consumption. There's some omics studies looking at gene expression in different kinds of alcohol intake, very interesting. And studies are starting to be done with wine, and I haven't seen for beer, but with wine, and then measuring metabolism and also microbiota in the gut and changes in the microbiota community after wine consumption. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards and share the slides, and you can go to the references. Alcohol, though, we must remember, is a risk factor for many cancers. I have to say this, from the National Cancer Institute, and it's unfortunate, but that is the case. So moderate alcohol consumption is, I'm from the United States, we have a long history of our relationship with alcohol may be different from other countries, but we do have a suggestion that up to 1 drink per day for women is where we should have the guidepost, and for men no more than 2. And also the recommendations say if you don't drink, don't start drinking is another thing in the U.S. anyway. That's what we are suggesting. And here's some of the serving sizes. And in wine there is wisdom, in beer there is freedom, in water there is bacteria. So With that, I'm sorry I went over, I think, but